Well, thank you very much. So for those of you in the room, I hope that you enjoyed that wonderful lunch. And of course, I'd like to welcome everyone who's beaming in from around Australia and possibly even the world through our live stream. So welcome to you all. Can I start by acknowledging again today the support of our sponsors. So our major sponsors, Serco, Siemens and Westpac, and our supporting sponsors, Sydney Water and the Star Entertainment. Once again, I'd like to encourage you to interact through our live Q&A, which is available through the link that you'll see on your screen through the live stream, and also for those in the room, it is CEDA.pigeonhole.at, and using the passcode NSWSOS. Not the we're in trouble SOS, because New South Wales is definitely not in trouble. The Twitter hashtag to use today is also hashtag State of New South Wales, and we'd like you to tag in also CEDA at CEDA_news. Now, a very warm welcome today to our keynote speaker, the Honourable Gladys Berejiklian, Premier of New South Wales, who will shortly deliver her keynote address. And also to Anthony Miller, Chief Executive, Westpac Institutional Bank, who will moderate the session today. With no further ado, it is now my job to introduce to you Helen Shaw, CFO of Serco, who will give some opening remarks and get the proceedings formally underway. Helen joined Serco Asia Pacific as CFO in August 2017 after spending 7 years with the organisation in the UK. Previous roles at Serco included Head of Commercial for Serco Group and Financial Director of the Justice and Immigration business in the UK. She is a highly skilled chartered accountant with a background in government contracting and PFI, PPP deals, which I know are something also very dear to the Premier's heart, having previously worked for Grant Thornton in the Government and Infrastructure Advisory team. Helen has an MA in Human Sciences from the University of Oxford and is a Fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. Please warmly welcome to the stage Helen Shaw.
Thank you very much, Megan. Ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests, good afternoon, and may I add my warm welcome to today's event. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So as Megan said, my name is Helen Shaw and I'm the Chief Financial Officer and one of the directors for Serco Australia. And we are delighted to be sponsoring today's event, building on our long-standing relationship with CEDA and supporting the valuable work that they do. For those of you in the room here, I think you will probably agree with me, it feels quite novel to be at an in-person, face-to-face event and makes a nice change to the virtual meetings we've become so adept at, even if it did mean we had to get out of our pyjamas. So today, CEDA has provided us with a great opportunity to not only hear from, but also to engage with the Premier on the plans for the future of New South Wales. And importantly, it's a future where the government continues to identify and commit to programmes that will deliver both considerable growth and productivity. Now, that we can gather, any of us can gather in this room today, serves as testament to the Premier and her team's tireless work throughout 2020. Now, all of us have our own stories of the challenges that we've faced this year, and Serco is no different. Some of you would know that Serco supports governments around the world in the delivery of public services. We work across health, defence, transport, justice and immigration, and citizen services. And we've now had the pleasure of supporting Australian federal and state governments for over 30 years, with our Asia Pacific headquarters here in Sydney. And we now employ more than 12,000 people across Australia. For us, like many of you, 2020 has been about resilience, how to continue delivering services and adapting to support the people we serve, whilst also keeping our people safe. Now, we all started the year shocked by the power and scale of the summer bushfires. But what really stood out during that period was the amazing response of the people across the country. Emergency services across Australia stepped forward, supported by the Australian Defence Force. And at Serco, we were very proud of our health staff who support the ADF They stood up emergency clinics across New South Wales, Southern Queensland, the ACT, and Victoria to support this response. Now, the mobilisation of these healthcare professionals within just 48 hours enabled 3,000 Defence reservists to be vetted prior to being deployed to communities in need. In close succession to the bushfires followed the global pandemic, which has so quickly gripped the world. COVID-19 has changed the way our society operates. It shut down businesses, it separated families, and it created the need to adapt to a new way of life. Now, like many companies who did continue to operate through the pandemic, Serco needed to work with our customers to rapidly adapt to evolving requirements. And during this time, we were able to offer 1,500 extra jobs to staff who'd been stood down from other businesses and industries. We rapidly expanded our services to the Australian Tax Office to ensure that small businesses and personal tax issues were resolved as fast as possible. And we stood up a new contact centre for Services Australia that commenced handling job seeker and MyGov calls in record time. Somehow, we managed to develop a solution that enabled the recruitment, training, skilling of over 400 agents and a full operational management team within just 25 days. Now, along with our consortium partners, John Holland and John Lang, we delivered on time and on budget for the New South Wales Government the impressive new Clarence Correctional Centre. Opening as scheduled on the 1st of July and accommodating up to 1,700 inmates, this state-of-the-art facility is focused on rehabilitation to reduce reoffending, whilst not compromising on safety and security. And it's through this project that we'll play a key role contributing to the Premier's priority of reducing adult reoffending by 5% by 2023. In addition, the project created 600 jobs and will generate over $500 million for the local economy in northern New South Wales. Now, I must say that transitioning and opening Australia's largest correctional centre during COVID is not something we are likely to have to do again. However, the innovation, partnerships, staff and organisational development built through these challenges will be enduring. I'm also proud that our integrated digital and call services for Transport New South Wales continued to help move thousands of people safely around the state. Now, the investments in digital innovations we've made over the past few years really added to the resilience of this service and allowed us to continue to play a part as the city reopened. Now, we all know how challenging 2020 has been, but we also know that challenges can often lead to opportunity, and that the rate of adaptation is usually increased when under pressure. We all now need to make sure that we harness the innovation and lessons learned to create future resilience. Now, we strongly believe that there is an important role for the private sector to play as governments grapple with conflicting needs, whether it's to help people get back to work, to build quality and resilience into public services, or to reduce deficits. The private sector can be successfully integrated with the public sector to deliver better outcomes, whether it be to provide resilience through just purely capacity, innovations through sharing best practice, training and skilling the next generation, or direct investments in infrastructure and job creation. And finally, we were particularly keen to sponsor today to get the opportunity to say a public thank you. Firstly, we actually want to thank the New South Wales Government. We want to thank you for your care and leadership during this period, for enabling us to stay as safe as possible whilst limiting the impact on the economy. We also want to say thank you not only to our own Serco employees, but also to those employees of our peers who work for the private sector delivering public services. Those frontline employees can sometimes be overlooked, whether they be cleaners in schools, porters in hospitals, call centre operatives, medical personnel supporting the ADF, or custodial officers helping keep those in our custody safe whilst continuing their rehabilitation journeys. We want to say a really big thank you to them for their efforts in 2020, ensuring that those public services could continue to the high standards we all expect. We are very proud of you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Anthony Miller, Chief Executive of Westpac Institutional Banking. Anthony very recently joined Westpac, in fact, just last month, after several years with Deutsche Bank. Now, at Westpac, he has responsibility for global relationships with corporate, institutional and government clients, as well as all products across financial and capital markets, transactional banking and structured finance. Would you please welcome Anthony to continue the proceedings?
Thank you, Helen. Look, it's great to be here, and let me say how much I'm looking forward to hearing from the Premier, as I'm sure you all are. Firstly, as with the others, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Also, I'd like to congratulate and thank CEDA for still managing to stage this event this year, and acknowledge the great work that CEDA does in bringing together politicians, business leaders, academics and others representing a broad cross-section to discuss the issues which are important to our nation, never more so than in this unprecedented time. I've recently arrived at Westpac, having joined as Chief Executive of the Institutional Bank only two and a half weeks ago. So while I'm still getting my feet under the desk, from my early conversations with our economists, our bankers and some of our institutional clients, it's very clear just how good a job the New South Wales Government has done under the leadership of the Premier in managing COVID. And while there is no doubt we have many challenges ahead, from what I'm seeing and hearing in our business, I believe there is much to be optimistic about. Speaking with our economists, they pointed to some of the key indicators worth considering. Firstly, New South Wales business conditions have snapped back. In September, they had fully recovered to where they were at the start of the year. There was a sharp 9.3% rebound in hours worked for September compared with the May low point, eclipsing all other mainland states. On the consumer front, New South Wales also looks to have posted a solid rebound from the June quarter lockdown. While some segments are clearly impacted by the social distancing and travel restrictions, our Westpac Card Tracker Index indicates annual growth in broad spending flows is some 7 percentage points above their pre-COVID pace. This index offers a timely read on spending shifts based on the millions of card transactions processed by Westpac every day. It's a significant result as it shows the activity in New South Wales is running above the level it was this time last year. On housing, the New South Wales market is essentially back to full operation. Sales and listings are back to pre-COVID levels and the Sydney auction market is active. Remarkably, there have been more auctions in the year to date than there were at this time last year, which also means the auction activity that we've seen has more than caught up for the April disruptions. Importantly, prices are also stabilising. The most recent Westpac Consumer Sentiment Index showed strong numbers, with the most striking improvements around the outlook for the economy in New South Wales, with a spectacular 17.5% point surge, hitting a 6.5-year high. These are terrific signs. There is also a massive pipeline of infrastructure projects, further buoyed by the recent federal budget injection of some $2.7 billion into New South Wales infrastructure. Westpac is privileged to work closely with New South Wales as a key partner in funding the state's infrastructure projects, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the Premier on this today. As I said, though, there are challenges and there is uncertainty, but this also provides opportunity. However, alongside this opportunity, it's important that we acknowledge we all have a responsibility to help to drive the economy in this challenging time. For the team at Westpac, it's a pleasure to partner with such a passionate, decisive and well-led government, backed by a public service team dedicated to delivering for the citizens of New South Wales. On that note, would you please join me in welcoming the Premier to the stage.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for that very warm and encouraging introduction, and you can introduce me any day of the week. Thank you very much. But it's a wonderful pleasure to be here at a very important occasion. CEDA is a place where thought leadership exists, where people are able to, in my position, able to convey our objectives and the way we see the world. And today I wanted to acknowledge all of you in the room for the enormous contribution you've made in supporting New South Wales and hence Australia during what's been arguably the most difficult 12 to 18 months in our state's history. And we don't say that lightly. We've all lived through it and we all know the challenges, but also the green shoots and the opportunities that lie ahead. And can I, in that vein, please acknowledge all the leaders from business who are here, from community organisations, from the Diplomatic Corps, the Public Service, Tim Reardon, who heads my department, and the secretaries and leadership of the Public Service. And also my parliamentary colleagues, Treasurer Dom Perrottet, who's in the throes of preparing the budget. And as Anthony was reeling off some of the green shoots that exist in the New South Wales economy, that exists because of the stimulus the Treasurer has announced. But the consequence of that is a hit to the New South Wales budget. So we built up the budget over a decade, but then have had to, obviously during the circumstances that we find ourselves in, make sure the economy continues to grow and prosper. And I want to especially pay tribute to the Treasurer today for his work as part of our team, his outstanding contribution to the state's economy and the state's recovery. And thank you, Dom. And I'm looking forward to your budget on November 17, so well done for your efforts so far. To Minister Ayres, who's the Minister for Jobs, Investment in Western Sydney, who's also been instrumental in the COVID recovery. Our Cabinet Secretary, Alistair Henskins, is here as well. And also, again, all of you who contribute so much to the thought leadership of this state. And again, 12 months ago, if I'd been asked to foresee what the state of the state might be like today, I don't think any of us could have foreshadowed the circumstances we find ourselves in. Certainly, the bushfires were catastrophic, but that came off the back of a 3 to 5 year deep drought, where 99% of the state was in deep drought. And of course, the natural disasters which also preceded the pandemic that we find ourselves in. But during this process, I think some of the lessons we've learned here in New South Wales is that when government has sound economic fundamentals, when government has collaborative relationships, constructive relationships with business and community and open lines of communication, resilience and being able to tough it out during these circumstances becomes all the more easier, as difficult as it is. And even though the baselines have changed, following on Anthony's comments, and I note some of the statistics that he outlined, even though the baseline has changed, New South Wales is still in the strongest position of any state or territory in Australia, and that's something we should be proud of. But New South Wales has also, I hope, demonstrated to all of you that we can manage the harsh impact of the health consequences of the pandemic, but also demonstrate balancing that out with the economic needs of our community. And certainly in terms of leadership, I think all of us who've been in leadership positions during this time have learned an enormous amount. One of the experiences for me was during the catastrophic bushfires, we literally threw out the rule book on how to manage a statewide response to something which affected every part of the state. And ironically, I took on board learnings from that experience to how we responded to COVID. So from day one, we allowed health to do what they do best. And actually the police in New South Wales have been in charge of our state emergency operations. So we made sure our response across government was holistic. It was horizontal and vertical all in one, and that we also pulled together the best and brightest minds we had from different teams to make sure we got the best outcomes. And this is the kind of flexibility and adaptability that governments aren't known for, but certainly the experience of the previous 6 months allowed us to do this. Obviously, as in any business, the clear lines of accountability and no daylight between the experts and government decision making. Now that is critical. Absolutely no daylight. And again, we rewrote the rule book on how to manage crisis and how to deal with situations in a very, very quick and flexible way. Interestingly, it's also important to note that you can't respond to a crisis of this nature unless the fundamentals are strong. And so our investment in health has been a decade of record investment, with the public health team, led by Dr. Kerry Chant, always having front and centre in decision-making in health in government. But also Service New South Wales, which is a one-off unique organisation to Australia, and I'm hoping other states will draw on this model. And Service New South Wales, we asked the Treasurer to give us 1,000 extra staff to Service New South Wales, which he did. And that organisation now is the front-end customer contact with business and all of our community organisations, and is really supporting us in the economic recovery. But also, of course, our response to the economy was swift. And as I've mentioned, the Treasurer's stimulus package in excess of $16 billion has ensured that the economic fundamentals we have today are not what they would have been had we not made those investments. So whether it was the $4 billion in payroll tax deferrals, $3 billion in bringing forward infrastructure over the next 18 months. And can I just stress, our infrastructure pipeline is in excess of $100 billion over 4 years. And I love the federal government and I'm grateful for the money they give us, but their infrastructure pipeline spend is that amount over 10 years. So as a state, we're actually spending that amount over 4, and that's stimulating jobs and also giving confidence to the business sector to invest off the back of that investment, which is so critical. But also, in addition to that, we've been able to accelerate our planning program. The planning minister, through reforms he's made during this process, never let a crisis go by without reforming what you can. And our planning minister has been able to accelerate, with the same approval processes, just in a more timely way, 100 projects which have since received approval in the last 6 months. Now, that is also generating jobs and investment and supporting our infrastructure pipeline, and also providing wonderful opportunities for small and medium-sized businesses to provide supplies. Because as we know, global supply chains have been disrupted. Australian supply chains, because of some stubborn premiers, have also been disrupted. So we've had to rely more than ever on ourselves and our adaptability to establish and create those new supply chains. And it's in that vein that Minister Ayres and I made a call to arms to New South Wales businesses back in March, and we said, we need you to start producing things you've never done before. We need you to retool. 1,600 businesses put their hand up. We now have 2 consortia who are manufacturing ventilators in New South Wales. We've got 2,000 of them. We're using one for COVID at the moment. We've got 2,000 of them. But we'll never have to buy one from overseas again, potentially, because we've got two companies now that are manufacturing ventilators. We've seen many organisations retool, and not just in the medical space, but support us in establishing some of those supply chains which have been massively disrupted. And again, our economic courage, our ability to push the boundaries and reform, but also push ahead with easing of restrictions and easing of borders, has come about because of our ability to manage the health response. And that is something that our team in New South Wales is very cognizant of. You can't push the economic boundaries if you don't have the virus under control. And that's been a message for us, and every time we want to ease restrictions, we've made sure that that is always top of mind for us. But again, I think the balance we've found in New South Wales is very encouraging. And of course, as I said, we've not let the opportunity of the last few months go by without reforming ourselves in the process. I'd like to think that when we come out of COVID, that we are a better and stronger government. We have less red tape because we've had to have less red tape. You don't have the luxury of time. You don't have the luxury of process. You have to do things flexibly and quickly. We've also been much more centralised in our decision making. Sometimes you do have to be more centralised. Sometimes the Premier or somebody else has to make a call in areas that you may not necessarily do that. I've often been criticised as being a micromanager, but in a pandemic it works. You have to be a micromanager. And I wear that criticism with pride. But also we've digitised ourselves like never before. The opportunities across government to actually provide better services to our citizens, but also to our clients and customers and businesses. A one-stop portal, tell us once. If you're a business or a citizen, don't have to tell us your story 10 times every time you talk to someone different in government. Tell us once, and we'll make sure we support you in whatever you're doing. And of course, as Anthony mentioned, we're already seeing the green shoots which are coming through in terms of the economic fundamentals. And whilst we have to accept that the economic conditions now are very volatile, and whilst we take the green shoots when we can, we also have to accept that the recovery in terms of the economic fundamentals is very uneven. And that's why today the Treasurer and I will be making an announcement which will support one area, key area of policy which we think New South Wales will continue to demonstrate leadership in. But in terms of retail, I nearly fell off my chair when I saw the latest retail figures, which showed that in terms of retail volume growth, we had the best result in Australia of an 11.6% increase. But that's almost better than pre-COVID levels of retail confidence. And unfortunately in Victoria, they had a contraction of just over 4%, but we had an increase of nearly 12%. And also the AIG Group's performance of construction index lifted significantly in September to a 2-year high. So here we are in a pandemic, but yet our construction index is still going in the right direction. But again, our motivation in New South Wales is not only to have record government investment, that only goes so far, but it's to encourage that business confidence, that business certainty. And I'm thrilled with the business confidence figures that we're seeing and also the level of certainty we're providing in terms of the operating environment. And that's why we've been so strong on borders. We want to increase our gross state product, but we can't if the other states don't buy and sell with us. We don't have those benefits of the international trade. We don't have the benefits of other opportunities that existed pre-COVID. We have to rely on ourselves more and more as Australian citizens. But also, notwithstanding, as I said, these green shoots that are coming through in terms of the economic fundamentals, the recovery is uneven and it's volatile, and we have to accept that. And one of the areas where there is a bit of softness, of course, is in jobs and jobs growth, and that's understandable given the position of a number of state premiers in closing off their states, but also in relation to the decisions of the Victorian government in locking down their economy. That's had a massive impact on jobs growth. And even though in New South Wales we're doing as best we can to control what we can control, we can't pretend we live in isolation. We live in a nation. We're not just states. And that's why I'm very pleased to announce today, alongside with the Treasurer, that New South Wales, as part of this year's budget, will invest $250 million in a Jobs Plus program. We will unashamedly encourage businesses to relocate their head offices to New South Wales. We will unashamedly call out not just to Australian companies, but companies from overseas who are already eyeing off New South Wales because of our success to make New South Wales their home. And what this program will ensure is that to June 2022, because we want to make sure the jobs grow in the near term, that we provide payroll tax relief up to a 4-year period. For every new job you create in excess of 30 employees, you will receive payroll tax relief for those employees for a 4-year period. Not bad. Is that pretty good? Okay. Obviously, we're also going to provide proactive assistance in navigating our planning system to make sure that you have good service when you want to fast-track projects, get advice, and make sure that we provide guidance to site selection and make sure you can set up your additional footprint. Also partnering to develop subsidised training programs to build specialised skills, because we know that when you're setting up extra jobs, you need to make sure you have the employees with the right skills. And this is off the back of 100,000 free skills courses we offered through TAFE. 100,000 people got qualified in something different during lockdown for free. And a lot of them now are in different jobs because a lot of people have had to go from one industry to another. We're also, as part of our Jobs Plus program, providing enabling infrastructure such as roads and utilities, those painful things that businesses have to consider when they're setting up or increasing their footprint. We will now take that burden, that load off you. And of course, you will also have access to our very successful one-stop shop through Service New South Wales, our Jobs Plus concierge service, to help businesses deal with one person in government, not several. And we're also looking to support you in providing accommodation and other government services where that's appropriate. So that for us is a huge boost, because providing jobs, keeping jobs and job security is the biggest challenge our nation will face and the globe will face in the next 6 to 12 months. And unless we get those policy parameters right today, hundreds of thousands of people will risk being out of the workforce. That's why it's so important to act now, and I'm incredibly proud of that investment. And I want to thank the Treasurer for being generous enough to sign off on that wonderful package. But in conclusion, before Anthony subjects me to a very rigorous cross-examination, what the past 12 months has, I think, demonstrated in terms of the state of New South Wales is that we're stronger than we thought we were, we're more resilient than we thought we were, we're world leading. I've said to our team in New South Wales, do not be afraid to do something that no one else in the world has done. And there are several examples where we can point to in that regard. We're innovative, I think we're more confident and optimistic, and we're more courageous. And as difficult and as harrowing as the last 12 to 18 months have been for our citizens, I believe we've asserted ourselves as a jurisdiction that isn't afraid to take the difficult decisions, but also is so protective of our citizens and their well-being, whether it's their social well-being, their health, or their economic well-being. And again, I know that New South Wales will continue to have a lead role in not only leading our state out of this difficult situation, but also leading the nation, because when New South Wales is strong, Australia is strong. And again, I want to thank all of you for being part of this process, and also for the process that we're embarking on beyond today. Thank you very much for your time.
Is that working? Okay. We're on? Great. Well, thank you very much for those remarks, Premier. Incredibly energising and invigorating, and your passion and drive is, as I say, infectious. So congratulations on an outstanding job. I've invited everyone to submit some questions, and we'll get through those. And just as we get people to put those questions through, one question for you. In the future, you'll write a book. You'll write a book about your tenure as Premier.
No, I'm ruling that out categorically.
The lessons in the last year, from a leadership perspective, you've been outstanding, and everyone unequivocally agrees with that statement. What lessons do you have in relation to leadership as a result of the last 12 months? What have you taken out of it?
Great question. A couple of things. Firstly, and I note the editor of the Daily Telegraph's here. Firstly, I would say when you have a crisis, lead as though you don't care what the commentators are going to say. You have to lead to make the right decisions, and that will give you confidence to make the right decisions. Learn from your mistakes, because mistakes happen when you're dealing with a situation which is unfolding, and when I think back to February and March and how little we knew about the virus itself and how we would respond to it, we learnt from a few missteps, and you have to take those learnings forward. You have to be confident in your decision making and very decisive and not procrastinate. And you also have to be adaptable and flexible, but also leadership is very much determined on strong teamwork. And I've got the best team in Australia right here in New South Wales, whether it's my colleagues, whether it's the public service, whether it's the business community, whether it's our community leaders. Unless you tap into the best and brightest your state has to offer, you have no chance. And that collaboration is key. It's how we've tried to run our government, but it's also, I believe, a hallmark of being able to deal with a difficult situation. It's not being afraid to learn and not being afraid to take those decisions forward, and also not being afraid to rewrite the rule book. I know Tim Reardon, my secretary, had a heart attack when I told him how I wanted to structure our State Emergency Centre and where I wanted to locate it, because it was different to what we'd done before, but I knew what we'd be facing is different to what we'd done before. So don't be afraid to do things you've never done before. Don't be afraid to learn from the rest of the world, but also to lead in some areas. I think I better stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Just taking further that thread around collaboration and teamwork and getting the right team, the National Cabinet and its performance through the pandemic and the opportunity to take something like that further and beyond the pandemic. What's your thoughts on that? What's the opportunity there?
Well, I think the opportunity with the National Cabinet overall has been positive. It's essentially the old COAG process without the red tape. But it's also been a process where the leadership's made decisions and then, implemented them. But early on especially, it was extremely effective because when you're kind of dealing with a situation that's unfolding and you've never experienced before, it helps to see what others are doing. But it also highlights how different the Federation is today than what it was when it first established. With all due respect to the other states, when Federation was first established, the states were pretty even in their demographics and their economic outlook. But, 100 years on, that's changed, 120 years on, that's changed substantially. And in New South Wales, we can't always afford just to go with the law of averages. We have to punch above our weight, otherwise the nation fails. So that's been an interesting process, very interesting process. And on some things, the National Cabinet's had massive agreement, on other things we haven't. But I think generally speaking, the PM needs to be commended for the process. It's been far more effective than COAG, and I think that deserves recognition, and I congratulate him for running the process as he has. Okay.
Just another, and a few more questions, please. But one question for you. That balance between health, economy, in so many jurisdictions, we just see people make it an absolute black and white choice, and it's divisive and it's emotional and it just evokes so many issues. How have you tackled that question as you've made pretty important decisions over the last 6 months?
Look, I'm not pretending there wasn't debate around our leadership team and around our government leadership in terms of how we should tackle things. But if you look at the experience elsewhere, in Europe and the US, in Asia, those countries which did not get a good grapple on the virus early on and let it get away with them have suffered the economic consequences anyway. The only way to economic freedom during the pandemic is to get the virus under control, is to give people confidence and certainty. And the worst thing you can do to business is say, we don't really know what's going to happen the next couple of months, right? Because then they lose confidence to spend, to invest, to hire. And that's the opposite of what we wanted. So our aim was always to provide a certain business operating environment, and we knew we had to do that by controlling the virus and by getting that under control. And it was a challenge. And I remember thinking to myself after the first lockdown, and I hope the only lockdown we'll ever have over Easter, that I never wanted to go through that again. So what did we need to do as a state to make sure we never had to go through that again? And similarly with the border closures, I've said to myself, I never want us to be in a position where New South Wales doesn't have open borders to all of our citizens across Australia and New Zealand now as well. And so it's almost testing the system every day. It's just pushing things as much as you can, but having the health under control is absolutely imperative to be able to have economic freedom and to push the economy forward. And again, as I said, today's Jobs Plus announcement we made is an unashamed grab for jobs. We know that some businesses set up in other states are very frustrated with what those state governments are doing, and they are eyeing off relocating to New South Wales, and we don't want to let that opportunity go. So we are encouraged by the feedback we're getting and have responded through this policy parameter.
Okay. Just a question that has come through, which I'll read it out to you. It's anonymous, so I will attribute as
They're always
appropriate.
the worst ones, the anonymous ones. Go for it.
Much of the focus on bringing forward projects has been limited to traditional roads and transport infrastructure. Can we expect this focus to widen to social infrastructure?
Well, if you mean social infrastructure and health and education, we've got record investment amounts in health and education, absolutely off the charts, in programs, not just hard infrastructure, but also in our digital spend. The Treasurer recently approved, and Minister Dominello, if you haven't met him, he knows how to get money out of the Treasurer, but we have a multi-billion-dollar digital transformation program in our government, which enhances the social outcomes because it allows for us to provide better services to our citizens. And we've also not taken the focus off our Premier's priorities, which include dealing with social issues like, as mentioned, about reducing recidivism and all those other things. So our investments are about across the board, because every dollar we invest now is creating a job, saving a job, and also growing our economy. And we have to have a holistic approach to that. So it's not just the traditional areas of expenditure, although I do like to highlight those because that is critical in giving confidence to the community. But please know that the extent of our spend in the social space is in excess of what's occurred ever. But we're also relying more on non-government support as well in terms of providing that expert service. And sometimes we'll insource something, sometimes we'll outsource it. We're quite agnostic about that. We'll do what's in the best interest of our citizens, but we're always looking at new opportunities, whether it's through social impact investment or whether it's through more interesting ways of structuring and financing those complex areas of government policy. Please know that the social agenda is as high as it's been.
Just taking that a little bit further, another question came in which just segues a little bit and says, many not-for-profit community groups have been struggling this year. Donations are falling, volunteer support is restricted due to the COVID challenge. Will there be some form of financial support or otherwise for these groups?
We have maintained our support and funding for a number of not-for-profits. That goes without saying, but I'm not going to promise or suggest that we'll be able to maintain everything we have in the past. We can't. During these difficult times, as businesses need to make difficult decisions, governments do as well, and our priority, unashamedly, in New South Wales is jobs, creating new jobs, protecting jobs, and also starting and building industries, which I think New South Wales can lead the world into the future. I mean, the tech precinct we've established here at Central, the Westmead Health and Education Precinct in Parramatta and the new Aerotropolis in Western Sydney Airport are just three examples of where we want the world's and Australia's best and brightest to congregate. And I think they're the opportunities we need to grab, and they're the opportunities we need to look at. And we have to be a bit discerning in what we support and what we don't support. But having said that, can I take the opportunity to thank many of the not-for-profits, because there are so many people falling through the gaps. Government tries to get to everybody falling through the gaps and we don't. And it's a lot of those not-for-profits and non-government organisations that are really picking up the slack, and I just want to thank everybody who's involved in that sector for what they're doing.
Just on a slightly different topic and different pace, so I won't attribute this question, but here it is. It's a little bit loaded. So should the GST distribution system be amended to ensure that it does not reward states that experience an economic slowdown due to unnecessary lockdowns and border closures?
Can I personally kiss the hand of the person who asked that question? Well, it is frustrating because in New South Wales, we try and be as efficient as we can. We try and be as courageous as we can. And certainly that's not matched by what other state governments are doing. We've argued and will continue to argue the case for GST reform. I find it curious that Queensland and WA have the positions they have when essentially we subsidise their states. I mean, essentially New South Wales and Victoria, in effect, when commodity prices aren't artificially going through the roof, New South Wales and Victoria essentially subsidise the rest of Australia through GST. But when Victoria's out of action, it's all on New South Wales. And that's why increasing consumption is so critical. And unless the other states understand that, they will receive a massive hit to their GST revenue. So this is why we are all connected. And this is why when premiers take a very short-term view of the world and not a medium to long-term, it's going to hurt them and their citizens in the medium to long-term. And that's why I've been quite outspoken in my comments, because, further to that question, unless we act as one national economy, we will suffer and our citizens will suffer.
Okay. Just taking another tact here. So we're all looking forward to the opportunities that will come with the stimulus packages and the budget. But adjacent or consequent upon that is a very significant debt loading. And so how do you think, or how do you worry, and what's your thoughts on that?
Well,
and obviously you've done a magnificent job getting the debt down over X number of years, and here we are.
When the cash rate's pretty much zero, you don't worry too much about that. If you were going to borrow, this is a time to borrow.
Back the truck up, is that
100%. Right? So can I say the strategy we adopted in New South Wales, again through the Treasurer, is a very sound one. We were in negative net debt, so we were actually cash positive on the balance sheet. Had a futures fund and pretty strong balance sheet. And now we're moving into an environment where we know the cash rate is what it is. So if there was ever a time to borrow, this is pretty much it. And I'm very confident of what the Treasury will outline in the state budget. But again, I want to stress that you can't have the economic stimulus we've had in New South Wales. You can't keep the economy going unless you've had a hit to your own budget. And that will be reflected on the 17th of November. And if we have to borrow more than what we used to, that's fine, because our borrowing rates are still far less than any other state, because we had that room. So when your economic fundamentals are strong, you've actually got greater flexibility in a crisis to respond, and greater freedom, because you've got a few options. And that's been, again, the work of nearly a decades of hard work to get us where we are. And now, given where interest rates are, we're almost, not quite at deflation, but getting to a stage where the rate is so low that I think the opportunities are pretty positive for us at the moment.
Here's another in relation to jobs and the focus on job creation. So how have you determined the priority skill areas? Often this is skewed to manufacturing. Has there been consideration of the priorities of the services sector, which employs so many?
Well, great question, because we did have a bit of a debate in government about whether we should identify certain industries on the job creation. And I said, no, let's make it market-led. Let's let the market decide what the jobs are of the future. Let's let industry decide the jobs they want to create. Because when government sets the parameters but the private sector responds, that's when you have sustainable jobs, not artificial jobs, not jobs that are just going to last 2 or 3 years. But sustainability is so critical in the jobs market. And what we've noticed in other states is their unemployment levels are higher, but not as high as what they should be, because they had a lot of people drop out of their workforce. The participation rate's actually dropping in a lot of states, which is a big concern. In New South Wales, it's holding up. So we need to be really honest about what we're facing in the jobs front. The jobs market across Australia, understandably, is weak. It's weak globally. But that's perhaps one of the most volatile and weak parts of our recovery at this stage, which is why we're complementing that with our Jobs Plus program in New South Wales. Other fundamentals are volatile but holding up consistently. The trend's going upwards. But we know what's coming in March with the end of JobKeeper, and we know what the June quarter might look like unless we take action now. And that's why our focus is on a market-led response to job creation. But of course, we also have our aims, whether it's through the precincts, through the IT precincts, or through the health precincts, through our tech precincts. We obviously have certain industries we've been chasing through advanced manufacturing, robotics, space, all those industries that are creating the jobs of the future. But currently, when you're getting yourself out of an economic depression or an economic downturn, you need to also allow the market to lead and provide that demand. So it's a joint process of targeting particular industries for the future, but also allowing the market to decide what jobs they want to create and where they want to create them.
And just take that a little bit further, how are you thinking about and targeting the opportunity given stellar performance relative to pretty much everywhere else in the world. Hong Kong, a little unhappy, a lot of talent there, a lot of capital there, looking for a new destination, Asia itself. How are you looking to capture that opportunity offshore, and what is the pitch offshore for New South Wales?
Great question. I've actually been spending a lot of time with overseas partners who are desperate to increase their footprint in New South Wales and also to relocate, and it's actually a great time for us. I think this is a time to assert our global leadership in what we've been able to achieve to date. But I always say that warily because every day is a challenge during a pandemic and you don't want things to go awry. So you have to maintain your focus on what you're doing, but also use the opportunity to really think about the future. And I think New South Wales is in a very prime position to attract that investment. In fact, the proactive approaches we've had from overseas destinations and partners is very encouraging, extremely encouraging. I recently also, Minister Rez and I hosted an event with the Deputy Premier on a number of overseas jurisdictions, but also our diplomatic corps who were very interested in giving us feedback from their home countries who are wanting to look to New South Wales. And I think the opportunities for us are huge, not just for New South Wales, but for Australia. And remember, for decades, we were locked out of manufacturing because of the cost of labour. But the jobs of the future require high skills, and that puts us back in the market. And we've got that highly skilled, educated workforce. We've got an adaptable workforce, and I think the jobs that are created in the future suit us really well. So we can be a lead manufacturing nation. And the call to action, or the call to arms we extended to business back in March, gave me additional confidence in relation to that. To have 1,600 businesses say we can retool within the next month and help you. And we weren't able to use all of their products, but what we did is put community organisations and others in touch with them because they were smaller scale. So some of them became direct suppliers to government and some of them became suppliers to smaller and medium-sized entities. But having said that, you don't realise what you're capable of until you're forced to kind of look at alternatives. And that's given us confidence to think about how we can become a manufacturing capital and how we can be the lead and specialist in a lot of areas, whether it's fintech, medtech. There's a lot of opportunities here, and I'm excited by those opportunities.
Okay. We're all grappling with how to think about getting people back into the office or get back to work, so to speak. What's the thinking, or at least the long-term planning around the nature of how we will work going forward in terms of the calibration of people in the office, people in back at home, or people going regionally, and how are you looking to sort of balance that?
I think flexible workplaces to an extent will stay part of the future, but they should not be at the cost of productivity. Can I say I'm a bit tough on that issue? We need to be as productive as possible. So long as productivity is not constrained, I think flexible workplaces have a place in the future, but there's no doubt the Treasurer and I have both been on a campaign, and other colleagues, to get people back to the CBD in a safe way. So we know that many organisations have, Team A and Team B, and they all come in alternate weeks, which is a good start. But the other thing that we have to be wary of is a lot of global businesses that employ a lot of people in the CBD are taking instruction from companies based in Northern Hemisphere, which are in a very different position to COVID as we are in the Southern Hemisphere or in Australia. But our aim is definitely, the suburbs are having a rejuvenation and growth. But also I think the CBD, if you notice, the activity levels have certainly increased. And I think over summer will be a good time for a lot of companies to test their systems in a COVID-safe way. And we're obviously thinking about ways in which we can increase, in a safe way, our capacity on the public transport network. So at the moment, Health has told us how many people can be on each mode of transport. But if you really want to increase the number of people coming to the CBD, you need to look at a safe way to address mass transit, and we're considering those options.
I probably shouldn't use this word, but I'm trying to keep the questions in clusters. And I just wanted to put this one together with that one. Just saw there's been a lot of focus on growing Pyrmont, including the new fish market. Is this an area that can see additional growth to support more jobs and investment? What are the best opportunities?
Well, I think there are few places in and around the CBD that are requiring additional development, additional work. So through the Planning Minister and through our whole of government approach, we're excited by a number of projects, including the fish markets and Pyrmont, which not only will drive jobs in the short term in terms of construction, but will be meccas for tourism. I remember Minister Ayres will know the statistic, but I think as many people go to visit the fish markets as they do the Opera House or something every year. It's quite an amazing statistic. I didn't believe, I had to ask twice and have it fact-checked 5 times, but it was apparently close to the case. And I think we have to look at those opportunities. We have to look at reasons to allow people to come to Sydney. There'll be so much pent-up demand for overseas travel once the world gets over COVID. We want them to come to Sydney and New South Wales. And at the moment, the regions are going gangbusters. Try getting a booking anywhere in regional New South Wales. I know people who've had to split up their bookings when they're going away for a week because regional New South Wales is experiencing pre-Christmas tourism conditions, which is fantastic. But Sydney, unfortunately, has been hit hard by the lack of international tourists and hospitality and a whole other reasons. So we are focusing our efforts on how we can rebuild parts of our economy that have been impacted the most in Sydney. And I think when you're looking to the future, and if you look at periods of economic downturn, they've always been, followed up by periods of massive economic boom. So if people around the world who've been locked up in their countries for a certain period of time wanted to think about somewhere to visit, we want them to come to New South Wales, we want them to come to Sydney and then regional New South Wales. And so I think there are opportunities for us to make sure icons like the Sydney fish markets, like our cultural institutions, like our beautiful natural beauty is really to the fore. And I've actually had a good conversation with our planning minister also about aesthetics and saying, what legacy can we leave on working off the natural beauty of our wonderful surrounds? I mean, public space has become so important. If you're cooped up in your home and you need to be outside, and it was a bit prophetic when I asked the planning minister to also be the Minister for Public Spaces, but now more than ever that's important. And when you're building something, how can you make it look pleasing? How can it be iconic? It's not just about the function and form, but it's also about the aesthetics and how we can really leave those type of legacies for future generations. And that's the thinking that we're doing at the moment. It's not just about the bricks and mortar, but it's how you do it. It's not just about updating the fish markets or updating buildings or public spaces, but it's how you do it and how you manage those opportunities, because they don't come by all the time.
Okay. I think we have to wrap it up based on timeline that was set out for me. One last question. What is the number one focus, the tiebreaker question you ask yourself that you have to solve for the next 12 months?
Oh gosh, there's several of them.
Has to be one.
Yeah, I know. I sound like a broken record, but we absolutely have to get jobs growth right, because we have hundreds of thousands of people in New South Wales who are on JobKeeper in March. And I don't want hundreds of thousands of families worried about whether or not they have a job beyond March next year. That has to be our priority. So I think job security, job creation, jobs growth is at the heart of our consideration at this point in time.
Okay. Well, Premier, thank you very much.
Thanks, Anthony. You did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. Very hard to keep up. So I'd just like to invite Naomi Knight, Head of Engineering at Siemens Mobility, Australia and New Zealand, to come up and give thanks.
Thank you. What a great Q&A. Thanks, Anthony. It was very entertaining. I got a bit carried away there with the clock watching. So today we've had the opportunity and the privilege to hear from the Premier of New South Wales about what matters in New South Wales and what our future targets are. I guess in a year that's tested all of our resilience, and those of us with families abroad know how well New South Wales is doing. It's brilliant to not have to be locked down. Contacting my family in Manchester who are on lockdown now till Christmas, I think. So this has been a brilliant outcome for us. So just a little short run through our association with Sydney and New South Wales particularly. Siemens has been in Australia since 1872. Some of you might not know that. Practically from the beginning of the technology boom in the world. So throughout this time, technology from Siemens has played a key role in New South Wales in industry and digitalisation space. So we also, just a few projects that we've been involved in. We powered the stage and auditorium at the Sydney Opera House, a thing that I didn't know until yesterday, and so I'm very proud to know that. And we also helped bring digital broadband radio to Sydney in 1984, so quite a long time ago. Additionally to that, more recently, I was personally involved in this, but the company delivered the substations for the current Sydney Metro, which is the first metro that we've had in New South Wales, and we're very proud of that delivery. We also recently declared the winning team on the ETCS Level 2 and traffic management system rollout. So going back to one of the points made earlier, this system will allow more trains on the existing Sydney Trains network without the need for major infrastructure projects from the civil engineering side of our rail business. So that's great for me being an electronics engineer, not so great for the civil engineers in the room. There's always a battle in rail. As with any community in the world, the state's success is deeply connected to education, something that I'm very passionate about, particularly women in engineering. And Siemens has recently signed an MOU with New South Wales to provide funding for 25,000 university students and to give the access to cutting-edge software for the development of those students into the workplace. We're particularly focusing on ETCS Level 2 and the Aerotropolis opportunities in providing this sponsorship, in acknowledgement that electronics and electrical engineering is quite low take-up in this state. It's quite difficult to recruit in those areas, as I'll get to shortly. New South Wales is critical to the economy of Australia, as we've just heard, in far more eloquence than I would repeat it. So it's really great to have this platform at CEDA, State of the State, to have this discussion and interact the politics of the state with the industry of the state. It's probably one of the biggest forums we have to have these hard-faced discussions and to hear directly from the Premier on her goals and targets going forward in the future. I'm just going to pick out a few things that have been said this afternoon that are very close to my heart in how I'm running my team. Collaborative relationships with industry. Time and time again across Australia, I end up in very, very adversarial meetings with clients, state clients, that never end well for either party. Collaborative relationships with industry are the way forward, and certainly the digital systems contract has been run in a very collaborative way, and hopefully the rollout over the next 20 years will remain along that line. It's very refreshing to be able to have those conversations with your client directly about what your product does and doesn't do, and not just have a strict set of instructive clauses in a contract to deal with. I'm really hoping the contract goes in the bottom drawer and we don't have to bring it out at any point in the next 20 years, long after I've retired. Transitioning learning from one episode to another was really fascinating. I think that's something that we try and do in industry. We're not there yet. Our lessons learned exercises on projects, I'm sure all you industry people have lessons learned it. It's really interesting to hear how you transition from the bushfire issue to the global pandemic, and how utilising the skills of what you'd learned there straight away allowed a better outcome. That's certainly something that I will be considering in our future projects. I think fast action following lessons learned are required, and we don't do that very often. $100 billion in infrastructure spend over the next 4 years. Absolutely brilliant, should be great for the jobs market, for those of us particularly in that infrastructure space. But the other thing that I think is essential, and something that I'm trying openly to promote in Siemens, is local recruitment and utilising local supply chain. It's so much better, you get a better outcome when you engage a local company who you can go and see, or, you know, currently maybe on the internet, but you can generally go and see and form relationships with. I find we get a better technical outcome. The Jobs Plus programme is super exciting. I think that's going to really help companies like Siemens focusing on the supply chain and our own recruitment. I currently am holding about 25 vacancies I can't fill. We're struggling to get electronics engineers into the rail industry. It's certainly something that I am actively promoting and would push anybody connected with universities to be advocating that particular degree and not always focusing on the major infrastructure civil engineering degrees. So that's something I will certainly be looking at with our human resources team. And finally, from me, I'd just like to thank Gladys, Premier Berejiklian, sorry. I wrote it properly as well. Sorry. On her vision and leadership for the state and for demonstrating the benefit of strong leadership. Micromanagement is something I'm very familiar with, as I'm sure are my team around Australia and New Zealand. So I do think it is necessary in certain circumstances. So just wanted to thank you for your amazing speech on the Q&A, which I found very entertaining. And I'm now going to hand over to Helen to do the closeout. Thanks, Helen.
Well, thank you very much. So we have now reached the end of what has been a fantastic State of the State lunch. But before we close, we wanted to share the results of the poll. The question posed was, as economies across the globe continue to face significant challenges in this pandemic, New South Wales's gaze is firmly on recovery. What do you think is the top priority to ensure the state's economic recovery? There was 4 options, and it'd be fair to say that the result is clearer than the American election. Option 1, with the highest number of responses, was investing in infrastructure to drive employment at 43.7%. Firstly, closely followed by bringing forward immediate reforms to support productivity at 31%. Still important, but not with quite so many votes, increasing self-sufficiency through local supply chains with 18%, and finally, investing in and supporting the New South Wales health system just at 7%, which I think probably reflects more the fact that it's already well invested in rather than that people don't think it's important. Unfortunately, and also unsurprisingly, that poll very much reflects the plans identified by the Premier, and these priorities really give confidence to the strength of those plans. Now, there is plenty to reflect upon from today, and I too would like to thank the Premier for her address, which I found very insightful and very confidence-inspiring. I hope everybody else did too. Now, I don't envy the government's job of having to balance public health and the economy during this recovery. But New South Wales is in great hands, and it's also in the best possible shape due to the actions already taken by the government. I also know that the private sector is ready, willing, and able to play our part in supporting this journey. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all the sponsors again for today's event, Westpac and Siemens as the major sponsors, along with Serco, Sydney Water and the Star Entertainment Group as supporting sponsors. Now, if you have any additional questions that you would like to pose, you can actually continue to post questions to the Pigeonhole for the next 15 minutes, and CEDA will include selected responses in the post-event email. Now, this post-event email will also include a link to the recording of this live stream and any speaker presentations if you would like to rewatch. And finally, before we leave, I'd like to let people know that there are more fascinating CEDA events to come and invite guests to register for these. They include the Opposition's Vision for Western Australia on November the 13th, the CEDA Annual Dinner on November the 16th, and Optimising Australia's Rail System for the Future on November the 17th. All of these will be live stream events, and you can visit CEDA's website at ceda.com.au for more information. So thank you to all of our guests, both here and on the live stream, for joining in this event. On behalf of you all, I would like to thank CEDA. Their work continues to be invaluable and without doubt helps to drive constructive policy discussions and business engagement across Australia. Please stay safe, everyone. Thank you.